This is a true story. In this video, you're about to learn how one woman's simple 50-cent metal washer changed the course of aerial combat in World War II. You'll hear the dramatic story of Beatrice Shilling, a brilliant engineer whose small but revolutionary invention saved over 2,100 RAF fighter pilots' lives by making Spitfires and Hurricanes outfly every German Bf-109. Her courage, ingenuity, and determination turned the tide in the skies over Europe, and today, her legacy lives on as a testament to brilliant problem-solving under pressure. This isn't just a story about engineering. It's about breaking rules to save lives, about trusting your instincts when everyone tells you you're wrong, about how the smallest solution can have the biggest impact. Get ready for a story rarely told, but one that changed history forever. March 14th, 1941, 7:42 a.m. RAF Kenley, Surrey. The morning mist hung low over the airfield, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with damp grass. Beatrice Shilling stood on the tarmac watching a Hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for what might be his last mission. She was 32 years old. She'd worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for 6 years. She'd solved dozens of technical problems, but she had zero solutions to the problem that was killing RAF pilots every single day. The Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the Channel that week. RAF pilots had engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. 14 Hurricanes had gone down, 9 Spitfires, 23 young men, 23 families receiving telegrams, 23 empty chairs at mess halls across southern England. The pattern was always the same. British pilot spots German fighter. British pilot pushes into a dive to attack. Engine cuts out. German fighter escapes. Or worse, German fighter circles back and puts bullets through the stalled Hurricane while the pilot fights desperately to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The technical problem Shilling had seen the combat reports. She'd read the maintenance logs. She'd interviewed pilots who'd survived the engine failures. She knew the technical details by heart. The carburetor flooded during -G maneuvers. Simple physics, brutal consequences. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a sudden dive, fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The main jet, the tiny brass nozzle that metered fuel into the engine, starved. No fuel meant no combustion. No combustion meant no power. The engine died for 1.5 seconds. 1.5 seconds doesn't sound like much, but at combat speeds, 1.5 seconds was an eternity. 1.5 seconds was enough time for a Messerschmitt to close 300 yards and open fire. 1.5 seconds was the difference between life and death. The Germans didn't have this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No float chamber, no flooding. Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, invert their aircraft without losing power for a single heartbeat. It gave them a decisive advantage in every engagement. British pilots knew it. They'd learned to avoid -G maneuvers. They'd learned to roll inverted before diving, keeping positive G-forces on the aircraft. But combat doesn't always allow for textbook maneuvers. Sometimes you need to push over hard and fast. Sometimes the enemy forces you into a dive. And when that happened, British pilots died. German pilots exploited it. Squadron commanders reported it. The Air Ministry knew about it. And the Royal Air Force was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The official solution Shilling had spent 11 months working on the problem. She wasn't working alone. The engineering teams at Rolls-Royce were designing a pressure carburetor, a proper solution, a complete redesign of the fuel delivery system. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the float chamber entirely. It would use a diaphragm-based system that maintained consistent fuel, pressure regardless of aircraft attitude. It was brilliant engineering. It would work perfectly. But the pressure carburetor wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 1944. 2 years. Maybe 3. The war wouldn't wait. The pilots couldn't wait. Every morning, young men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing their own engines might kill them before the Germans got the chance. Every afternoon, ground crews counted the aircraft that didn't return. Every evening, squadron commanders wrote letters to mothers and wives explaining how their sons and husbands had died. Engine failure during combat maneuver, a technical problem. Bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. Shilling knew better. This wasn't bad luck. This was a solvable engineering problem. And she couldn't wait 2 years for Rolls-Royce to solve it. Beatrice Shilling wasn't like other engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She'd grown up taking apart engines. Not because anyone taught her, because she was curious. At 14, she'd saved money from odd jobs and bought her first motorcycle, a Norton. Her parents thought she was insane. Young women in 1,920 seconds, England didn't ride motorcycles. They certainly didn't take them apart. Shilling didn't care what people thought. She'd stripped the Norton's engine down to individual components, learned how every part worked, understood the relationship between fuel, air, compression, and combustion. Then she'd rebuilt it. Better than before. At 16, she was racing that Norton at local events. At 25, she'd raced it at Brooklands, the famous British racing circuit, 106 miles per hour's average speed. Fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, the highest honor in motorcycle racing. Only 3 women in history had earned that award. Shilling was the second. Racing had taught her something universities couldn't teach. She'd learned how engines failed under stress, high G turns, sudden acceleration, extreme lean angles, rapid throttle transitions. She'd learned to feel what an engine needed before the gauges told her. That intuition had made her the best carburetor specialist in Britain. Breaking barriers, Shilling joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after war was declared. She was one of 2 women in the engine department. The other woman was a secretary. Shilling was Principal Technical Officer in charge of carburetor research and development. It was an extraordinary position for a woman in 1939. Most engineering departments didn't hire women at all. Most of the men she worked with had never met a female engineer. Some of them didn't believe women belonged in engineering. They said so, loudly, repeatedly. Shilling didn't argue with them. She just outworked them, solved problems they couldn't solve, designed modifications they couldn't design. She didn't care what they believed. She cared about keeping pilots alive. And now British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't handle combat stress. The solution had come to Shilling in January 1941. She'd been lying awake at night thinking about the problem. Again, for the 1000th time. The float chamber flooding happened because fuel could flow unrestricted when gravity reversed. In normal flight, gravity pulled fuel down, the float valve controlled fuel level. Simple, effective. But in a dive, gravity reversed. Fuel surged upward. The float valve couldn't compensate fast enough. The carburetor flooded. The engine died. Rolls-Royce was trying to solve this by eliminating the float chamber entirely, replace it with a pressure-regulated system. That would work, eventually, in 2 years. But what if you didn't need to redesign the entire carburetor? What if you just restricted the flow? Not completely, just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get fuel, just not too much fuel at once. A brass disc with a precisely calculated hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. It was elegant. It was simple. It contradicted everything she'd been taught about carburetor design. Every engineering textbook said you never restrict fuel flow. You optimize it. You maximize it. But Shilling wasn't trying to maximize performance. She was trying to prevent catastrophic failure. Precision engineering Shilling machined the first restrictor herself in the RAE workshop. Brass stock, lathe, drill press, precision measuring tools, brass thimble shape initially, 0.125 inches in diameter. The hole in the center was 0.04 inches. Those dimensions mattered more than anything. Too large and the carburetor would still flood. Too small and the engine would starve at full power. She'd calculated the optimal diameter based on fuel flow rates, engine displacement, and carburetor jet size. Then she tested it. Built 17 different prototypes with different hole sizes. 0.035 inches, engine, power dropped 15%. Too restrictive. 0.05 inches, carburetor still flooded occasionally. Not restrictive enough. 0.04 inches, perfect. Engine maintained full power. No flooding during negative G tests. Then she'd simplified the design. A flat washer was easier to manufacture than a thimble, easier to install, easier to replace if damaged, less brass. Lower cost, faster production. She called it a flow restrictor. Later, RAF personnel would call it something else. Bench tests showed it worked. She'd mounted a Merlin engine on a test stand and simulated negative G conditions by tilting the entire assembly. The restrictor prevented flooding every single time. But bench tests weren't combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour. Combat was negative G forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death in 1.5 seconds. She needed to test it on an actual aircraft under actual combat conditions. The problem: authorization installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated about 40 different regulations. The Air Ministry had strict protocols. Every modification required documentation, testing, approval from multiple departments. The process took months, sometimes years. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Shilling would be court-martialed, maybe imprisoned. Her career would be over, her reputation destroyed. She weighed the risks. Court-martial versus dead pilots. Regulations versus results. Permission versus forgiveness. She decided to skip permission and ask forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, Shilling had 6 restrictors in her leather satchel and one very cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years. He'd seen 19 pilots die from engine failures, 19 young men who might still be alive if their engines hadn't quit at the worst possible moment. He didn't ask questions when Shilling showed him the brass washer. He just nodded and reached for his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad. Pilot inside, engine warming up. 20 minutes until takeoff. They had to work fast. Cooper worked with practiced efficiency. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor. The restrictor slid into place. He brazed it with a small butane torch, creating a permanent seal. 60 seconds of work. The modification was invisible unless you knew where to look. No external changes, no added weight, no altered performance characteristics, just a tiny brass washer that might save lives. Shilling checked the brazed joint. Clean, solid, professional work. Squadron Leader Davies would fly with the restrictor. He didn't know it was there. Shilling hadn't told him. Hadn't told the squadron commander. Hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation. Just a dead pilot and a brass washer that shouldn't have been there. Shilling accepted that risk. The test flight, the Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power, 12 cylinders, 1,030 horsepower. The sound that had become synonymous with British resistance. Davies ran through pre-flight checks. Oil pressure, 60 pounds per square inches. Good. Coolant temperature, 105 degrees Celsius. Normal. Magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward. Tail wheel lifting as airspeed increased. Then the main gear left the tarmac. Shilling watched it climb. 800 feet. 1,000. 200 feet. 2,000 feet. The Hurricane banked south toward the channel. She'd brought a pair of binoculars. She watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet, where 2 more Hurricanes joined him. A section of 3, standard patrol formation, Davies leading. They flew toward Dungeness, where German fighters had been active all week. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he'd have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. Shilling waited on the tarmac with Cooper beside her. Neither spoke. Ground crew prepared 2 more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled past. Mechanics shouted technical jargon, normal sounds of a fighter station at war. Shilling heard none of it. She was calculating fuel flow rates, pressure differentials, G-forces, 0.04 inches. Maximum flow at full throttle. Negative G duration 1.5 seconds. The math worked, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed, an hour. Radio silence from Davies' section. That could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters, or contact so intense there was no time to report. Or Davies was dead and his Hurricane was scattered across a French field. At 0937, the radio crackled. Controller's voice. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Shilling raised the binoculars. 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft, no losses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit. Davies landed first, touching down smoothly. He taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, climbed. Out. Shilling walked toward him, her hands shaking slightly. She'd designed bombs before, tested engine modifications under laboratory conditions. She'd never done anything like this. Never installed an unauthorized modification and sent a pilot into combat to test it. Davies pulled off his helmet. He was smiling. That was unusual. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. They usually looked exhausted, haunted by what they'd seen and done. Davies looked excited, energized. Cooper asked the question, "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Shilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." Shilling asked Davies to describe exactly what happened. He'd spotted 2 Messerschmitt, 109 seconds at 14,000 feet, both aircraft flying east toward France. Davies had positioned his section above them, altitude advantage, the hunter's position. He'd pushed into a steep dive, 400 miles per hour. Negative G forces strong enough to lift him against his harness straps, pulling blood from his head, graying his vision at the edges. The dive that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin kept running. Full power through the entire dive, steady, reliable, perfect. Davies had closed to 200 yards before the German pilots saw him. He'd fired a 3-second burst from his 8, 303 Brownings. Saw strikes on the Messerschmitt's wing root, pieces of aluminum skin tearing away. The German fighter broke hard right and fled toward France, trailing glycol coolant. Davies had pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The engine had performed flawlessly throughout. It was the first time in 11 months that Davies had successfully pressed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. The first time he'd been able to dive without fear, without hesitation, without wondering if his own aircraft would betray him. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Shilling told him everything. She explained the restrictor, the brass washer, the fuel flow limitation, the unauthorized installation. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds, processing, understanding the implications. Then he turned to Cooper and said 5 words that would change everything. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station, today." Shilling explained it wasn't authorized. That there could be consequences, courts-martial, disciplinary action. Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenley had lost friends to engine failures. 19 pilots dead in 6 months. Men they'd trained with, flown with, drank with in the mess. Davies said if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed working engines. Rapid Deployment Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. Word spread through the squadron like wildfire. Pilots gathered around, asking questions. How did it work? Was it reliable? Would it really solve the problem? 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 3 days. 0 engine failures during negative G maneuvers. 12 diving attacks successfully pressed against German fighters. Attacks that would have been impossible a week earlier. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly, better than perfectly. Some claimed they were getting more power at altitude. The psychological effect was immediate. Pilots who'd been cautious, defensive, constantly worried about engine failure, suddenly felt confident, aggressive, willing to press attacks. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. Phone calls flooded RAF Kenley. Could Shilling visit their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be manufactured? The revolution had begun. Shilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. She'd created something the air ministry couldn't ignore. Results. Measurable, undeniable results. But she still needed official approval for mass production. Authorization from people who valued procedure over innovation. She got approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal. A war-winning modification, they called it. Rolls-Royce received the production contract. They could manufacture 500 restrictors per week. Installation would begin immediately at every fighter station in Britain. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines, every Hurricane and Spitfire in fighter command, every operational training unit, every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off production lines at Castle Bromwich came with restrictors pre-installed. Pilots started calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce. It was crude British humor, slightly inappropriate, completely unforgettable. Shilling didn't mind. She understood how military men dealt with stress. If crude nicknames helped them remember the modification, she'd accept any name they wanted to use. The results were undeniable. March 1941, before the restrictor. RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks. April 1941. After the restrictor, engine failures dropped to 0.4%. The kill-to-loss ratio improved from 1.3 to 1 to 3.2, 1 inch a single month. Beatrice Shilling had changed aerial warfare with a 50-cent brass washer. Beatrice Shilling continued working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, 33 years of service. She worked on dozens of projects: cold weather modifications, high-altitude fuel systems, supercharger efficiency upgrades. In 1948, King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She died on November 18, 1990, age 81. Her legacy lives on in engineering schools worldwide. The restrictor is taught as a case study in elegant problem solving. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Shilling in her honor. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Shilling building for engineering students. Small brass washers sit in museum cases as reminders that elegant solutions don't require complexity. Sometimes the biggest problems need the simplest answers. This is a true story. Beatrice Shilling saved 2,100 RAF pilots with a brass washer that cost 50 cents. She did it by trusting her instincts, breaking regulations, and putting lives above paperwork. Sometimes the hero isn't in the cockpit. Sometimes the hero is the engineer with the courage to act. Subscribe to Voices from WWII. Like if you think Beatrice Shilling was a